So a couple months ago, my wife Erin and I, she's sitting right here, we got a dog, and his name is Vince. And Margaret, if you can hit the first slide. So that's Vince, okay? So we got Vince from a rescue. We think he's mostly red-bone coonhound, but he's also got some basset hound in him. So from the shoulders up, he's like a big dog. From the shoulders down, he's like a little dog. And so he sits real low to the ground, but he's got a nice big head. And when we were first talking about it, I was worried about what a dog was going to cost. And Erin grew up on a farm. She grew up with animals. I never had pets. So I didn't understand. She kept saying, I just need another heartbeat in the house. I never got it. But we got Vince, and now I love him. I understand what she's saying. And, I'm always looking for better beds for Vince or better toys. The money doesn't seem to matter anymore. But the other day, Vince kept getting his two front paws up on the kitchen table, and he'd hop back up on there, and he'd nose around for something, or on the counter. And I was getting real frustrated. I was saying, come on, Vince, quit doing that, And then Erin reminded me that when we first got Vince, he looked like the second slide. So when we first got Vince, he was starving. And so you can see his ribs there. He was just a little guy. And he's not really sad there. That's just how he looks. But when we got Vince from a rescue, and we took him to the vet said his ideal weight is probably about 50 pounds, and that's where he's at now. When we got him, we figured he was probably somewhere between 20 and 25 pounds. And that's after he'd already been at the rescue for a couple months, getting at least one can of food a day. So we fattened him up. Now he's fat and happy. But so Erin reminded me when I was so frustrated that he was getting up on the table and getting up on the counter, she said, don't forget, Vince used to be a starving dog. Sometimes he used to have to go find his food, and he forgets sometimes that we're going to feed him all the time. And so it's funny because, we've had Vince now for over 2 months, but he just can't seem to forget that he used to be a starving dog. He doesn't catch that he's no longer a starving dog. He's now something different. He's a dog that's loved and cared for. And that's not unlike us in our walk with God. We forget that we are no longer what we used to be, but we are now chosen, redeemed, and living the life that God planned for us. Thanks, we don't need to look at Vince anymore, as I'm sure we'd all love to. One of the perks of getting to come up here is you get to show off pictures of your dog, Just wait till we have kids. It'll be... I'll say, yeah, the kid forgot he used to be starving. That's right. So we're continuing in the story of Exodus, and we can bring the lights back up a little too. We're continuing in the story of Exodus, and like I said, we're going to be what we need to remember today. What I think this story is going to tell us today is that we need to remember that we are no longer who we used to be. We are no longer who we used to be. And that's something that the Israelites go through in today's story out of the portion of the story of Exodus. Every time I've been up here in the last 15 weeks or so that we've been doing this series, I've made a point to say that we're preaching through the story of Exodus, not the book of Exodus. This is the first week where we can prove to you that's true because the story we're looking at is out of the book of Numbers. So it's Numbers, really chapter 13 and 14. And now we will read the whole thing. No, not really. I'll summarize it for you. At this point, the Israelites it's been about 15 months since they left Egypt. So they crossed the Red Sea, and they've been in the desert for about 15 months. We talked about how they stopped at Mount Sinai, and they received the law. And now they've been traveling from Sinai, which is kind of down in the south, up to where the Promised Land is. And if you know the geography, you know that Israel is a long, skinny tract of land. So they came from Egypt. This is your vantage point, not mine. They came from Egypt. They went down to Sinai, and they go up to Israel. And at this point, they're at the bottom. And they're at the southern tip of Israel. And Moses tells 12 guys, heads of families, to go into the Promised Land and scout it out. So the nation of Israel is divided into 12 tribes. For the 12 sons of Jacob, his name was Jacob, that his name became Israel. So his 12 sons make up the nation, the tribes. So one guy from each of those tribes was selected as this team of scouts to go into the Promised Land and check it out. Moses says, make sure the soil's good, make sure the crops are good, see what kind of people live there, check it out. And they come back, and they say, the 12 guys, they say, man, that land was phenomenal. They cut off a cluster of grapes that was so big, they had to tie it to a pole and carry it between two guys. That's the kind of crops that were in this land. They said, it is amazing. They said, it flows with milk and honey, just like you said. And But there are 10 guys, 10 of the 12, who say, but everybody who lives there is huge. They're really big, and their cities are fortified. There's no way we can take this land. And then 2 guys, Caleb and Joshua, they say, no, God is for us. Let's just go up and take it. Let's do it. But the 10 guys who are really scared and worried, they say this is absolutely a terrible plan. They tell Joshua and Caleb to be quiet, and they spread word throughout all the Israelites who are camped there in the desert. They say, we should not go in. We'll surely die. Our wives and our children will be taken prisoners. This is a bad idea. So now the whole nation figures that. And then Aaron and Moses, Aaron is Moses' brother who's the priest, Aaron and Moses, and Joshua and Caleb, the 2 guys who went in, said, let's go in and do it. The 4 of them kind of repent on behalf of the Israelites. It says they tear their clothes and they cry out and they say, we got to do this, and an argument ensues. And as that argument is going on between the Israelites and these 4 guys who are trying to be faithful to what they believe God has told them, the presence of God hovers over the tent where God meets with Moses. It's basically he's ringing the doorbell. So Moses goes over there into the tent, and there's this conversation. This is all in Numbers 13 and 14. There's this conversation. And God says, what is up with these people? They never believe me. They won't ever get it. He says, Moses, I'm just going to wipe them all out, and I'll make a nation that comes from you. And you'll be the head of this nation, and I'll do everything I was going to do through you. And Moses says, no, God, you can't do that. He says, the Egyptians already know that you rescued these people out of Egypt. They know that you're out here with them in the desert. If they hear that all these people died in the desert, they won't ever believe that you're really the God of all creation. And so God says, okay, you're right. I made a promise. I'll keep that promise. And he says, but none of these guys who are alive right now are going to go into the promised land. He says, all the Israelites are going to wander around in the desert for 40 years until everybody who's alive now, except for Joshua and Caleb, everyone else who's alive now will die off. And a new generation will come, and they will go into the promised land. So Moses tells the Israelites this, and they're really worried about that prospect. So they say, okay, never mind. We'll go in. And Moses says, too late. You already lost your shot. But they try to go in the next day anyways, and they get slaughtered. So that's the story for today. And there's a few things I want us to kind of sit on. There's kind of a progression of 4 things that the Israelites said and did when they saw this land. So the 12 spies went in, and the 10 of the 12 who are not faithful, they say this. First, they say, the land is amazing. Just like God and Moses said, it's awesome. The grapes are huge. The soil is fertile. It flows with milk and honey. It's great. We buy that. Got it. But second, they say, the people there are huge. They begin to compare, and they say, we were grasshoppers in their sight, and so we look to us also. Or we were grasshoppers in our sight compared to them, and so we look to them also. So they say those people are huge, and I think this is less an issue of intimidation and more an issue of comparison. They see the kind of people that live in the promised land, and they say, we could never be like them. They say, if that's what you look like as a citizen of this area, that's not us. We are too small, we are too weak. That's not us. Comparison. And then they say their cities are fortified. They say, man, it would really be too hard to take that land. They look at it, they say, it's really great, but you know what? We could never be those people, and in fact, it would be too much work to take their cities. We couldn't do it. We couldn't do it. We couldn't take those cities. We couldn't conquer those cities. We couldn't do it. Too much work. And so their conclusion, we should just go back to Egypt. They actually say we should just go back to Egypt. It wasn't as bad as we said it was. We know that place. It's better. We'll just do that because we looked at the promised land, and while it's great, we could never be like those people, and getting in there and conquering those cities is too hard, too much work. At the same time, Caleb then comes back, the faithful spy, and he says, none of that matters because God is for us. He says, God is with us. We know that to be true, so let's go in and take it. And what happened here was in looking at the externals, in looking at the circumstances, the other 10 guys were saying, we are still slaves of Egypt. who we are just slaves who have traveled across the desert. Surely we couldn't be these big, strong people who live in the good house in the good land. And surely we couldn't overcome these cities because we're just slaves from Egypt. That's who they believe themselves to be. I'm just a starving dog. But Caleb says, no, we're something new. We are chosen by God. We are redeemed by God. There's a new reality in our life. We're a new kind of people. This is who we are, so let's take the land. Let's take what's ours. This is our God. He says this is our land. We'll get it. It's ours. There's something different about Joshua and Caleb that isn't stuck in believing that they are still what they used to be. But the other 10 guys and the rest of the nation still believe they are slaves from Egypt. And you can empathize, can't you? As a people, they lived in Egypt for 400 years. For the last 40, they were slaves. It's only been 15 months since they left. 15 months ago, I moved from Georgia. I mean, it's not that long. I've only been here 15 months. It's not that long. So they were having a hard time believing that they were no longer slaves. And you know, it's funny, God sends them into the desert, right? They don't actually go back to Egypt. It's not like they actually retreat all the way because they're different. They are still God's people in the desert. They don't die in Egypt. They don't die as slaves. They don't go back to being what they were because they're already changed. They just couldn't buy it enough to enter into the promised land. And you know, this is one of those moments where it's kind of like, have you ever had an argument about who's maybe doing the dishes around the house? Maybe with your spouse or your child, and your expectation is you're going to come home and the dishes are going to be done. But maybe your husband or your wife or your son or your daughter, they didn't do it. So you come home and you say, I can't believe you didn't do the dishes. Can't believe you didn't get that done. You never do the stuff I ask you to do. You know, I'm working so hard, and you never really get it done. And they say, well, you don't really see what I do. I was working on this, and I was doing that, and I shouldn't have had to do the dishes anyways. And they say, well, you just don't respect me enough and love me enough. So then the person who's supposed to do the dishes, they say, fine, I'll just do the dishes. And they go over there and they start throwing things in the sink and they're, scrubbing. And then the person who came home, they say, no, never mind, don't do the dishes. It was never really about the dishes anyways. Right? That's what happened between the Israelites and God right here. God said, go into the promised land. They said, no, we could never be those people and it's too much work. We're really just still slaves from Egypt. And God says, you never have enough faith. You never believe I'm going to carry you anywhere. You never believe I can take you in. You never believe I've made you into a new person. And they say, fine, you want us to go into the promised land? We'll go in. And he says, no, that's never what it was about in the first place. So they get slaughtered. So what was it about? What was it about? If it wasn't really about going into the promised land, what was it about? It was about them actually becoming the people who actually believe that they are new, that they are changed, that they are not what they used to be. Becoming the people who believe that they serve a God who can carry them into the promised land no matter how big the people are or how fortified the cities are. It's about them becoming new people. And so he says, you know what? I'm doing something bigger than this generation. So this generation will die out until a new generation comes that believes I really am the God of all creation. Because it was never really about getting to the promised land anyways. It was just about getting them to be the people of God so that he could do something through them. If they can be the people of God, they'll take hold of that land. And living in the promised land, the rest of the world will see them and say, how'd you get this prime real estate? How are you guys so awesome? People will look at them and say, you're so huge. Your cities are so fortified. Who's your God? And they'll say, he's amazing. He's a God who rescued us out of Egypt and carried us into the promised land. It's amazing. That's the point. That's the point. The point wasn't getting there. The point was becoming the people that he called them to be, rescuing them out of something else so they'd no longer be slaves, but now they're redeemed. They're kings and queens of a heavenly Father. That's the point. That's the point. And so for us today, what's it about? You know, I look at this story, I look at coming out of Egypt and going to the promised land, and I think the temptation is to say, the promised land is a destination, that's heaven in this story. That's salvation. But I think salvation was coming out of Egypt. We were rescued out of sin, they were rescued out of slavery. We were slaves to sin, they were slaves to Egypt. So they're already saved, and that's the point about Dad was making between the services to me. That's the point about they never went back to Egypt. They never lost their salvation. They just didn't get into the promised land, this generation that died. For us, I think the promised land is the life that God has promised us. Like, we're already saved, but there's more. It's that more that is the promised land for us. Galatians 5 talks about the fruits of the Spirit. The fruits of the Spirit. And you've heard these before. And what I believe it's Paul, the writer of Galatians, what Paul is saying here, in verse 16 he says, so live life according to the Spirit. And then he goes through, and in verses 22 to 25, he does the list that you know, that many of us know. If you don't, I'll mention some of them for you. He says, the fruits of the Spirit are these: joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, self-control. He says, when the Spirit lives in you, this is what you're going to look like: joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, self-control. And we look at that. And our reaction is not so different from the Israelites who looked at the promised land. The first thing we say is, wow, that's amazing. If my life could be all joy, peace, patience, kindness, and self-control, that would be amazing. You're right. That's awesome. That's the life abundant. That's great. That's the first thing we say. But then we say, I've seen people who live like that. I've seen people who all they do is manifest joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, and self-control. I've seen people that manifest those things. They're saints. They're saints. I could never be like them. Don't you know I'm just a recovering alcoholic? Don't you know I struggle all the time with anger? Don't you know I'm chronically impatient? I've seen the people who manifest the fruits of the Spirit, and that's not me. And then we say, and you know what? I just think I'm not that disciplined. It would take too much work. I couldn't actually wake up every day and center my life around God. I couldn't actually, every time I see someone in need, have a heart of generosity. I couldn't do that. It's too much work. It's too much work. So we say, yeah, you know what? That life is amazing. Those grapes are huge. But the people who live there, I'm not like them. And what it takes to get there, I can't do it. And so we say, we'll just go back to Egypt. I'll just rely on the old way of doing things. Because really, I'm just a slave from Egypt. I'm just a recovering alcoholic. I'm just chronically impatient. So I'll just make do with what I got. I'll just make do with what I got. So what does that look like? What does it look like when we try to retreat, to make do with what we got, when we settle for less than the life abundant? When we believe that we are that old person and we're not actually being made into something new? Romans 7, and we will read some of this. If you'll turn with me to Romans 7, verses 4 through 12, page 1117. And now, I'm going to read this in a different translation because this is a really heady passage. So what Paul is doing here is trying to explain the difference between life by the law, read 10 Commandments and Old Testament, life by the law versus life by the Spirit. And he talks about it in terms of what will it produce? Will it produce in us life or will it produce in us death? And so this translation I'm going to read from is called The Message. It's like a modern paraphrase. So there's two kinds of translations, literal and paraphrased. We've had paraphrased translations throughout history. This is a modern one. I'm going to read from this, and in explaining this, whether we have life by the law or life by the Spirit, does it produce life or death? The translator uses some language that could be a little bit evocative. It might evoke some emotions. I'm not trying to bring up any bad memories or anything. Like, I'm not trying to evoke anything in you necessarily, but bear with me as we read through the whole thing, and I think you'll get the gist. It says this. I'm going to start at verse 4 through 12. Again, it's a different translation than you have. So, my friends, this is something like what has taken place with you. When Christ died, he took that entire rule-dominated way of life down with him and left it in the tomb, leaving you free to marry a resurrection life and bear offspring of faith for God. For as long as we lived that old way of life, doing whatever we felt we could get away with, sin was calling most of the shots as the old law code hemmed us in. And this made us all the more rebellious. In the end, all we had to show for it was miscarriages and stillbirths. But now that we're no longer shackled to that domineering mate of sin, and out from under all those oppressive regulations and fine print, we're free to live a new life in the freedom of God. But I can hear you say, if the law code was as bad as all that, it's no better than sin itself. That's certainly not true. The law code had a perfectly legitimate function. Without its clear guidelines for right and wrong, moral behavior would be mostly guesswork. Apart from the succinct surgical command, you shall not covet, I could have dressed covetousness up to look like a virtue and ruin my life with it. Now we're at verse 8. Don't you remember how it was? I do perfectly well. The law code started out as an excellent piece of work. What happened, though, was that sin found a way to pervert the command into a temptation, making a piece of forbidden fruit out of it. The law code, instead of being used to guide me, was used to seduce me. Without all the paraphernalia of the law code, sin looked pretty dull and lifeless, and I went along without paying much attention to it. But once sin got its hands on the law code and decked itself out in all that finery, I was fooled and fell for it. The very command that was supposed to guide me into life was cleverly used to trip me up, throwing me headlong. So sin was plenty alive, and I was stone dead. But the law code itself is God's good and common sense, each command sane and holy counsel. So, again, heady stuff, kind of complicated concepts. But I think this speaks to what it looks like for us to stand on the verge of the promised land, stand on the verge of life by the Spirit, stand on the verge of the fruits of the Spirit, and say, you know what? I could never be that person. It's too much work. I'm going to go back to the old way of doing things. In that first chunk, verses 4 to 6 there in Romans chapter 7, we see that once again it's about union with God. So he talks about, in Christ, we've been freed to marry another. We've been freed to marry another, a resurrection life. And so it's about a union with God. And he says, when we have a union with the law, we produce death. When we have a union with the Spirit, we produce life. So that's verses 4 to 6. Then verse 7 was kind of a big chunk in this translation. And this is where he says, the law produced in me sinful desires. And this is kind of one of those backwards concepts. But the idea is this. Paul uses the example of covetousness, coveting things. And he says, before the law, I went through my life, and the opposite of coveting something, I would say, is being content with what I have. So he says, before the law, I went through life, and I was content with what I had. The law came, and the law said, do not covet. And I said, well, what's coveting? And somebody said, well, coveting is wanting what your neighbor has. And so I said, hey, you know what? I never thought of that, but my neighbor's lawnmower is pretty sweet. My life would be better if I had his lawnmower. And all of a sudden, I'm coveting. If I just live life naturally, I don't think to covet my neighbor's goods. But the law comes and says, do not covet, and I say, oh, so there's a boundary here. So how close can I get? Like, is it okay just to think he has a nice mower, but I don't want it? Like, is that coveting yet? Okay, can I go a little farther? You know, I had a friend who the other day was saying, I bought this book. I have the paper version. And he said, so doesn't that mean I should be able to download the e-copy? Well, I don't know, did they give it to you? Well, no, but I can download this software. It's called Pirate Bay. And if I download Pirate Bay, I can download this, what would normally be an illegal copy of the book, but it's okay because I already bought the paper copy. Well, but once you have Pirate Bay, can't you download all kinds of illegal stuff? Yeah, but I'm just going to get the book that I already bought. You know? So it's going, okay, well, there's a rule, so how close can I get to that rule? And that's how we begin to define our life. When we define our life according to rules, we start to push those boundaries. When we define our life according to rules, we start to say, what else can I get away with? And Paul says this is not the way to go. And that's where, in verse 9, that's where he was saying, without all the paraphernalia of the law code, sin looks pretty dull and lifeless. And that's, he says the law served a purpose, but life by the law was never the end goal. Life by the Spirit was the end goal. So just like, remember, when we begun this series, Egypt had a purpose. The Israelites went to Egypt because they were suffering from famine in another area, and there was food in Egypt. So they went there, and that was God's provision. It had a purpose, but it was never the end in mind. The end in mind was that they'd get to the promised land where there's grapes so big you have to carry them on a pole. That's the life abundant. And so they said, let's just go back to Egypt. We can't really be the people who live in the promised land. And we say, we can't really be the people who live by the Spirit. Let's just go back to living by the law. Just give me some rules to follow. because I can't really live by the Spirit. It's like I played baseball when I was younger. And I played baseball through high school. And my last year and a half or so, I played third base. And my favorite third baseman of all time is Chipper Jones, Atlanta Brave. Okay? He's actually from right up the road in Volusia County. And he's a great third baseman. And the thing about third base, they call third base the hot corner. Okay? That's where you get a lot of hot ground balls. You got to be quick on your feet. And there's some acrobatic plays you can make. One of them is somebody bunts it down the third baseline. You charge. And then you have to end on your throwing foot. And you can barehand the ball and throw it over to first. Okay? It looks really cool. You throw off of one foot. You're on the run. It's awesome. And then if there's a hot ground ball to your left. And the thing about third base is, if there's a ball to your left, it's yours if you can get it. The shortstop is supposed to come behind you. He's the backup. But if it's a ball to your left and you can get it, it's yours. So then if it's really far away, you go and you catch it in your glove, and you have to transfer it to your hand and shift your weight to your throwing foot and throw over to first. And so these are plays. I'm watching TV. I see Chipper make these plays. And I see that, and it's amazing. Okay? But I look at him and I say, he's a ball player. I'm just a high school kid. I couldn't really do that. I couldn't do that. But at practice, we try, right? So we put some rules in place. We say, here's step 1, 2, 3. So the way you make that bunt play is you're supposed to start with your left foot. As you get close to the ball, you stutter step if you have to, so that you can end on your throwing foot, so you can grab the ball with your bare hand, and you keep running, and as you step with your left foot, you throw over to first. And so you can break it down. You can break it down. And on that play to your left, you start out going to your left, you catch the ball, and then as you're transferring the ball to your throwing hand, you're coming across with your throwing foot, and you plant, and you throw, right? We can break it down into steps. We make some rules so that me, just a high school kid, maybe I can make that play if I work hard enough. But really, I don't believe it. I have a hard time believing it. But then we were playing a game, and we were playing at DeLand High School, and they play on Stetson's Field, so it's a beautiful field. The grass is perfectly even. The clay is nice and flat, so you get a true hop on all these ground balls. So when I played this game at Melching Field, I think it's called, I had one of the best fielding games of my high school career. So I was playing third base, and sure enough, a ball was hit to my left. And I went after it, and now I wasn't thinking about start with your left foot, cross over this way, make the transition, plant your right foot. I just said, there's a ball, I got to catch it and get it to first. And in that moment, I was no longer just a high school kid. All of a sudden, I was a ball player, right? Before I watch on TV, I say, he's a ball player. I'm just a high school kid. Surely I can't make that play. But in this moment, I believed I was a ball player. And I was able to go over there. I caught that ball, and I grabbed it, and I threw it. And all of a sudden, I fell on the ground on my side. And I realized I had made that throw completely horizontal to the ground. That's the kind of thing you see on TV and you go, that's not me. That guy's a ball player, right? But all of a sudden in the moment you believe it and you become it. And you're not what you used to be anymore. So that's where you and I, we come up to the border of the promised land of the Spirit of life. And we say, that freedom looks like too much for me. I can't handle freedom. Why don't you just give me the old way of life, give me another set of rules, because that's a lot easier. And that's really who I am anyways. I'm just an alcoholic. I'm just someone who struggles with patience. I would be no good with freedom. Freedom is too much for me. I need a set of rules. Well, that's not true. In the resurrection life, Christ has chosen you, claimed you, and renewed you. Ezekiel says he's going to take out your heart of stone and put in a heart of flesh. Now you live life by the Spirit, and you're not who you used to be anymore. And there's no set of rules, there's no set of regulations that's going to get you there. You just have to believe it. That His Spirit lives in you, and He's made you new. That's all there is to it. That's all there is to it. We want to define ourselves from the outside in, but God wants to define us from the inside out. We want a nice little boundary so we can figure out exactly where we're allowed to live. But God wants to put a spirit in us that's just going to consume the environment around us. We say, exactly how much space can I fill? Exactly how much domain is mine? And he says, all of it. I put my spirit in you. It's going to overflow, and you're just going to be this person all around you. It's not a step-by-step process. It's not a class you can take. It's a spirit he puts inside of you. And the temptation is to say, what does it look like? What does it look like? Some of you are still going, so what Bible study do I do? Right? What is there like a 365-day devotional or something? No. It's done. You're it. You're going to walk out of here and you just have to believe it. That his spirit lives in you and it animates your life. The promised land is yours for the taking.